What's up, YouTube? I was putting a lot of brainstorming into how to put this video together. A few people in the last video in the comments, as well as a few people on Discord, have started asking for like a sideboard guide video. And I was like, oh, well, that sounds like something I can probably do. I don't usually use like physical paper -1+1 sideboard guides, but I've done like a matchup guide series with Shadow before of, oh, in these matchups, I kind of board this stuff in, this stuff out, and this is my general game plan. And I thought that would be something interesting to do with Dimir, but instead of having like a 30-minute dive on each matchup, I would do one video covering a whole bunch of matchups. And I think what I'm going to do is, and I'm definitely kind of winging this as we go, so bear with me. I think what I'm going to do is go through each matchup, and I'll timestamp all the individual matchups. So if you want to jump right to some point to see my thoughts on a specific game, then you can do that. But I'm filming this with the impression that we are disregarding game one. Game one is completely out. There's so many games that you go up against Amulet Titan or Tron, and you got a handful of fatal pushes in the blind, and you just lose, and there's nothing you can do. Or you go up against Merfolk, and they've got Cavern of Souls Aether Vial, and you're sitting there with Counterspell, Counterspell, Spell Pierce, Force Negation, Murktide, or something. Those games are going to happen. There's really not a lot to talk about with them. I do think we could do a video at some point on like pivoting game one, like when you start recognizing what you're up against, how you need to shift your game plan in accordance to what you see. But this video is going to be purely about games 2 and 3. The beauty of Magic the Gathering is that regardless of how game one goes, regardless of how bad the matchup is game one, how bad your luck is game one, you get another chance. At least one more chance. A lot of times, two chances. So, kind of letting that first game go, accepting that things couldn't have changed, I think is a really big relief factor for letting you to go into sideboarding kind of prepared to reevaluate and reestablish your position in the matchup. So that's what we're going to do here. As always, if you're enjoying this kind of content, let me know in the comments below. Also, we'll have links down below for the Twitter. It's the first place it gets updated whenever a new stream's going live. The Discord, if you want to come join the Control Freak Discord, talk sideboarding there or anything else you got going on. Link to the Twitch so you can come check out a live stream. And I'll have a link to this deck list. So if you're wanting to see what I ran, what is done very well for me, got me another RCQ final split. This is the list. So yeah, we'll hop back in with the first matchup. Stay tuned. I do have to throw a little interjection before we start the video that I want to preface this by saying all of the decisions that I'm going to talk about, all the sideboarding adjustments, what cards I do or don't value in the matchup, is all based off of my experience, what has worked for me. It might not work for you. If you disagree with some of the card choices, that is completely fine. Run what works for you. But this is just to give you some ideas to think about, some things that you might not have considered before that is actively working for someone, this guy. So yeah, if you disagree, totally fine. Run what works for you. Don't listen to me. But hopefully this helps kind of get the creative brain juices flowing, so you can take some of this and what's the word for it, build onto your own sideboard plan for a lot of these matchups. All right, first matchup, one of the absolute scourges of the format, and one you've probably run into plenty of times. Probably one of the ones people are most interested in seeing on this video is Boros Energy. And I am going to do Boros and Mardu separately. I think they have enough differences in what you need to be thinking about that I'd like to have them on a separate video. But I was doing some thinking before I started the Boros section here. And I thought it would be a good talking point to bring up what Boros is likely to bring in. And then we'll get to our deck list and we'll kind of talk about what we're bringing in, why we're bringing it in, what we're cutting, why we're cutting, and then go through some mulligan decision making or kind of what you're looking for in your opening hand. And we'll do that for each matchup. But I'll try to keep it fairly brief, do my best. So we'll see what happens. Either way, I'm just going off like the very first list I see of each of these decks. I'm not going to do too much of a deep dive to find a bunch of nuanced lists. So if you start saying, oh, well, Boros doesn't run 2 Sunspine links. Well, this one does. So tough luck. Boros is likely to be bringing in stuff like Chain to the Rocks for sure. Really good answer to Murktide, to Frog. I've seen some bringing in Sun Cleanser. I don't think it's necessarily that impactful. Like, it stops you from putting counters on Frog if you already have the Frog out and they target it with the Sun Cleanser. But overall, I don't think that's a very effective card. Soul Guide Lantern can come in. Just be able to snag a yard, keep a Murktide from coming down. Some of the cuts might include Lightning Bolt getting trimmed. Maybe some of the 1-drops on the draw, like Ocelot Pride on the draw, isn't quite as good as Guide of Souls because it does die to Orcish Bowmaster. Maybe a couple Blood Moon on the draw, but less likely. A lot of trimming on their end, not a lot of just hard cuts. So on our end, usually when I'm thinking of sideboarding, I think of what cards do I want to bring in, and then what can I afford to take out to match those cards. Because more than likely, if I've got stuff in my sideboard that I want to bring in, it's better than the vast majority of my main deck for that matchup. So it's all about getting the better cards into my deck more so than it is about getting the bad cards out of my deck. If that makes sense. So against Boros, Stern Scolding, kind of an auto include in. Unlicensed Hearse and Nihil Spellbomb, for me, are both kind of auto includes just because they both answer Flage. They both like take that graveyard aspect out of the game, and you really need to have something to answer Flage. For Boros specifically, well, first off, Deluge definitely coming in. For Boros specifically, for me, I'll consider a Surgical Extraction. I say Boros specifically because they're going to have 4 Flage and 4 copies of the One Ring. Both of which can like end the game for you on the spot if you don't have an answer to them. So against Mardu, I'm less likely to bring in the Surgical, but against Boros, I probably am bringing in 1 Surgical. Sideboarding out really comes down to play versus draw against Boros. On the play, I'm more likely to leave in something like Harbinger of the Seas, but on the draw, I'm definitely taking it out. So we'll do like a, draw either, kind of mix it up. Tamiyo more than likely coming out between Galvanic Discharge, Lightning Bolt, Flage. They just have a lot of really clean answers to Tamiyo. Consigned to Memory, I'm definitely taking out. It really gets to a lot of play draw decisions for me against Boros. So for example, on the play, Orcish Bowmaster is a little bit better because it can kill a turn 1 Ocelot Pride on our turn 2, which is kind of tempo-y. But on the draw, I think Bowmasters is completely horrible. The reason for that being, if they do have the turn 1 guide, they're going to get to hit you with it and start going wide before Bowmaster comes down. You run the risk of them running something else in the meantime that you have to answer to. And if you Bowmaster on your turn 2, you run the risk of them having Blood Moon on turn 3. So for a lot of those reasons, like Bowmaster on the draw, exponentially worse. So on the draw, I might cut like 3 Bowmasters. On the play, I might cut like 2, because I still don't think it's that good into something like Guide a Soul Start. And this is definitely a hot take on my end of not liking Bowmasters in the matchup. And I say hot take. It's like a lukewarm take, let's be honest. Because at the end of the day, the only 2 things, or 3 things, that Orcish Bowmaster kills is Ocelot Pride, the cat token off of Johnny, and Amped Raptor. You don't care about killing the Amped Raptor because it's already gotten its value. Ocelot Pride depends on the board state. Like an Ocelot Pride by itself, nothing else is happening, your opponent's passing turn, great, kill the Ocelot Pride. But if they've got like an Ajani out, you don't want to kill the Ocelot Pride. Same thing with the cat token off of Ajani. If they've got the Ajani, they got the cat token, you don't want to kill the cat token. So all these things like make Bowmaster look worse and worse. And you start saying, oh, well, you can Bowmaster in response to a 1 ring and like shoot some stuff down. I promise you, Boros is sitting at like a healthy 25 life at that point. They don't care about your Bowmaster pings. Like, they will find interaction for that Bowmaster. They will overwhelm your ability to protect that Bowmaster. They will kill you despite having the Orcish Bowmaster. It is not that impactful of a play against Boros. So if you want to board out all of the Bowmasters, I can see it. On the draw, I'm usually shaving a Frog, because I think them having turn 1 or turn 2 pass, or even like turn 2 1 mana play, pass with a mana, whatever. I don't want to play the Frog into that, because if I have to start discarding cards to a Lightning Bolt or a Galvanic Discharge on my turn going to their turn 3, that makes it even more likely that something like Blood Moon is going to get me, because I'm really locking myself into having to have Force Negation plus Frog. So I might trim like a Force to go along with the Frog. On the play, I'm definitely keeping the Force and the Frog in, because them having 1 mana on turn 1, maybe playing a 1-drop, maybe not, maybe playing Frog on 2 and passing with Force up is one of the better ways to win this matchup, because now they have to have like double white removal spells for the Frog. And a lot of the times they'll lead with a red removal spell, you discard a couple, keep your Force, and then they go for the white one and you force it. And you're down like 4 cards, but you've got a 3/4 Frog that never has to worry about a red removal spell again. And you can just find copies, like more copies of counterspell as you go on. And it's a really good way to kind of leverage that ability of Frog to draw a few extra cards. So, draw, yeah, kind of board out on the play, board out on the draw, counterspell on the draw. Some of this slow stuff that doesn't really interact early. So yeah, I would do something like, say, this is draw. Something like these 7 on the draw, or these 7 on the play. What did play or draw? I don't know. Something in this stack of cards on the play versus draw. I'm just more likely to board out Force, Frog, Extra Bowmaster, Harbinger on the draw, and more likely to keep in like Psychic Frog, Force on the play. It's a lot of not perfect formula, because you're reacting to how your opponent is playing the matchup. For example, if they're aggressively getting basics as soon as they find out you're Dimir, I'm boarding out Harbinger, play, and draw. If my opponent's really big on getting Surveil lands early, then I'm probably keeping Harbinger in. If they're more likely to tap out on one of their early turns, then I'm probably keeping Harbinger in. If they're jamming Ocelot Pride turn 1 instead of Guide of Souls, then I'm probably keeping Bowmaster in. Just play it by ear. Don't get pigeonholed into playing the matchup one specific way. Just be kind of fluid. All right. Let's hop into the next one. Okay. Second matchup, Mardu Energy. I did want to point this one out because, like I said, it is nuanced enough that you aren't taking the same approach as you do against Boros. For example, no Blood Moons means that like our Harbinger of the Seas look exponentially better. So I'm definitely keeping in both Harbingers against Mardu. They do have a little more graveyard synergy than Boros does with like Chthonian Nightmare. Some lists are running 2 or 3, some only 1 like this one. A little less Flage in this list, but I still think 4 Flage is kind of what I would expect. I wouldn't expect people to cut down on Flage just because they're going Mardu. Ob Nixilis can be a pain, so if you can kind of keep the early board clear, then Ob Nixilis isn't that big of a deal. If you do let your opponent kind of snowball the early game with Ocelot Prides, then Ob Nixilis can be a really big pain. Bowmaster, really good card, but really overvalued in the Dimir matchup. I do think a lot of the times, like, not only Mardu Energy, but like Dimir FrogTide mirror match opponents kind of think Bowmasters is this lights out card against Dimir, and it's really not. So sometimes you can catch your opponent just like not playing a proactive 2-drop like Amped Raptor or Johnny because they want to hold up Bowmasters, and you gain like some incidental tempo there, which is really nice. Also, the Mardu builds are a lot less likely to have things like Chained to the Rocks, lower number of static prisons. So post board, you're going to find yourself in a lot more positions where jamming Frog on turn 2 is very advantageous on the play or the draw, because they're not going to have as many 1-for-1 answers to it. So there's a better chance it's just going to get to sit around, live, maybe discard to a red removal spell. They could have Fatal Push. Thankfully, Fatal Push is a lot worse against Murktide Regent than like Static Prison and Chained to the Rocks are. And by a lot worse, I mean just doesn't hit it at all. So against Mardu, I'm doing things like boarding in the extra Harbinger, not boarding in the surgical extractions. Like I said, they're not as big on the One Ring. They still have Flage, but they don't have the One Ring, so I'm not as worried about taking one of those 2 out of the equation completely. The Consigns definitely coming out. Again, Tamiyo coming out. We've got Bowmasters and Galvanic Discharges and Fatal Pushes and Flages. Just a bunch of ways to deal with Tamiyo. So I'm less excited about that. I definitely will trim one, maybe both of the Force negations in this matchup. They do have Thoughtseize, as well as more creatures than Boros. So Force kind of looks worse all across the board. Probably trim like a Spell Pierce, maybe 2 Spell Pierce for the same reason. Higher creature count, less like Blood Moon effects or the One Ring. So something like that would be my sideboard plan against Mardu. Like keeping all the Bowmasters here because they do have a set of Bowmasters. So just another creature that Bowmaster can profitably interact with. Gives you a little more of a swing there. After sideboarding, I didn't really talk about it with Boros. I think we were kind of running long in that little segment. So I'll talk about it a little bit more with Mardu. Things you're looking for post board, Frog or Murktide early are both Excellent, excellent, excellent. Spell Snare is one of, if not the best card in the matchup because it answers a Johnny, Amped Raptor, opposing Bowmasters if you want to, Chthonian Nightmare, Goblin Bombardment. If they were running something like Unlicensed Hearse, it answers that. Just hits like all of the big things that Mardu is doing. Little bit less good against Boros because of the one ring, but against Mardu, definitely a lights out card to have access to. Uh, Hands that let you get down Harbinger early are really, really nice. So if you've got a hand with like a couple fetches, maybe one of those gets a basic swamp, then you can work towards trying to bait your opponent into tapping down low for a Harbinger. If you've got 3 mana and a Harbinger, and your opponent's got an uncracked fetch, don't play into it. Like, save the Harbinger, try to pass through another's turn cycle, because there is a really, really, really good chance that your opponent is going to not respect Harbinger and just go get like a Surveil land as soon as you don't show them Harbinger, because they need to filter their draws and be more on curve and proactive. So let them do that. Let them get that Surveil land instead of playing around Harbinger, and then maybe go to your next turn with like Harbinger plus Spell Pierce or Harbinger plus Spell Snare, something that lets you interact a little bit more. But don't just like jam it into their fetch land because you have Harbinger on turn 3 and let them get the free fetch for like basic mountain or something. Now, if you see a basic or a fetch land that gets a basic plains but not a basic mountain, so like a marsh flats, you can be a little more aggressive with it, but I still wouldn't recommend it if you can avoid it. Hands with some sort of grave hate are nice, but honestly, at the end of the day, I don't think Flage wins that many games for them. We've got 4 Counterspell, 4 Archmage's Charm. We can find the Deluge or the Grave Hate eventually. Harbinger is a way to lock out the double red, double white. We've got Cling to Dust in the main. Like, a lot of ways of answering Flage or keeping it from killing us. So don't feel like your entire post-board plan needs to revolve around how do I stop my opponent from flaging you. It really, really doesn't. You just kind of naturally stop Flage by playing your game. Mardu not really bringing in anything too important. Just make sure your opponent doesn't resolve a Chthonian Nightmare or a Goblin Bombardment, and you should be okay. If they do find a Goblin Bombardment, you have to be way more proactive after that at countering 2-for-1 creatures. So Amped Raptor, a Johnny, Bowmasters, things that can present not only damage on the ground just attacking, but extra reach with the Goblin Bombardment. And if you've got a Sink into Stupor, I know they're like way over here, so they're hard to see. But if you got Sink into Stupor in like your opening hand, try to make that your last possible land drop if you absolutely need it. That way, if your opponent does resolve a Nightmare Bombardment or something, you can have Sink to reset it. Or if they go to escape a Flage, sinking it back into hand can buy you a whole lot of time. So I guess that's it for Mardu. Time for the Dimir. One of my favorite matchups in current Modern. I think the Dimir Mirror is an absolute blast. Absolutely love it. I think the play is really, really immersive. Lot of minor decision making to be had. Really fun match. And if you want to see the Dimir Mirror played out, we do have a couple leagues on stream that are on the YouTube right now where you can go check those out. Yeah, so let's dive into the Dimir Mirror. things. I guess I can just like talk it all on one screen, because more than likely the things that we're bringing in are the same things that most Dimir mirrors are bringing in. Before I start breaking it down, I will say Mystical Dispute, I think, is the best card in the mirror match. Like, period. It's a counter spell that your opponent often can't pay through, especially if it's like a Psychic Frog early or a Murktide Regent, even if they have Counterspell up or 2 mana up to represent Counterspell. Archmage's Charm can't be spell snared. Spell Pierce looks really bad into it. I just think the card, like being on the draw with a Mystical Dispute, you feel like you can't lose. So if you've got a lot of Dimir mirrors in your local metagame, I would highly consider 2 or 3 copies of Mystical Dispute. Also has the really big advantage of overlapping with stuff like Goryos and the new mono blue Belcher decks. So Mystical Dispute stock, I think, is going to rise a little bit. But stuff I expect Dimir to bring in for the mirror: Mystical Dispute, your Grave Hate, Stern Scolding, kind of about it. Sometimes you'll see people bring in Surgical Extraction and say like, oh, you're a threat light deck, I'm going to bring in surgical all your frogs or something and win the game. Let's talk about why that's kind of a fallacy. So think of it in terms of card advantage, in that if I've got a copy of Psychic Frog and my opponent kills my frog and then goes to surgical all of my frogs, I've used 1 frog, I've played 1 card, my opponent's played a removal spell for the frog, surgical extraction for my frogs in the yard. Now I've got no more Psychic Frogs. Now if I had another frog in hand, it kind of becomes net even. But there's no guarantee I have another frog in hand. You don't have hand disruption more than likely to verify that I do or do not have another frog in hand. So this is probably just a blind surgical. If I don't have another frog in hand, then you start banking on the fact that I was going to draw another frog, which isn't guaranteed. So you've still 2 cards for my 1 with no guarantee of any extra value past that. Like, you just went down a card to get rid of something that may or may not even come up in the future. So please don't bring in surgical in the mirror. You need every card you've got. And if your opponent's wasting theirs to like surgical something, it means they have 1 less way of protecting what they've got going on, or 1 less card to interact over your next thing that you're going to resolve. So Mystical Dispute, fantastic. The Grave Hate, really good at shutting off Murktides, as well as shutting off flying from Psychic Frog, can be relevant. Stern Scolding, really good because it answers Psychic Frog, Bowmaster, Harbinger if they left some in for whatever reason, Tameo. Board outs. Some people will say Force Negation. I'm actually a big fan of Force Negation in the mirror, because if your opponent makes the first flinch, so if they go for the first spell on their turn, like a turn 4 Murktide plus Counterspell backup, and you counter their Murktide and they Mystical Dispute your counter, and you counter their Mystical Dispute, and they go for another counter like a Spell Pierce or something, then you've got the chance to get the final say with Force if it's going on in their turn. Or if you like tap out for a frog past the turn, your opponent goes, oh, tap out for shoot the sheriff, and you force it. The game's probably just over on the spot. Now, I am more likely to board out Force on the draw. So Force on the play, I'm probably keeping in because of frog. Force on the draw, I'm probably boarding out. Consign and Harbinger, kind of auto board outs. Not a big Pierce fan in the mirror. Usually the only turn 2 plays your opponents are making are Bowmaster or Frog, which you can't pierce. And then once they get down to like Murktide Regent, you have to have a counterspell anyway, counterspell Mystical Dispute to fight over the Murktide. So if they counter that back, then Pierce starts becoming live. But it's really situational on when that fight occurs. If they go for Murktide on turn 4 with counterspell backup, then counterspell their Murktide, they counterspell your counterspell, you pierce their counterspell, looks great. But if they go for turn 6, Murktide, counterspell their Murktide, counterspell your counterspell, pierce their counterspell, pay 2, they have a Murktide, you lose. So you can kind of take it into account how aggressive your opponent's playing in those situations. But I might do something like board these 5 out plus like a force on the play, and then on the draw board out an extra force, maybe board a pierce back in, or just keep a force in. It's so situational on like what you're expecting your opponent to do. So if I see Unlicensed Hearse out of my opponent, this is a card that is better on turn 2 than it's going to be on any other point in the game. So having like Pierce in on the draw for a turn 2 Unlicensed Hearse is a very big consideration. Or Pierce on turn 2, so that if my opponent plays out a frog and I go to Fatal Push it and they force my Fatal Push, I can pierce their force and win that counter war. You just have to adapt as you go. And that's a lot of what reactive decks in Modern are, is adapting to what your opponent's showing you to try to make more optimal decisions in real time. So if you see your opponent boarding in a bunch of Unlicensed Hearses, Pierce being in is a lot better for you. If you see them boarding in a lot of like Mystical Disputes, then you pray to a higher magic power that they don't find them all. Just roll with the punches. That's about the best I can say, is decide what is most impactful for you. For me, in the mirror, I think Unlicensed Hearse is a lights out card on the board, and Mystical Dispute is a lights out card on the stack. So anything I can do to make those 2 cards less relevant is really nice. Just don't ignore Bowmaster. I know that's completely tangential to what I'm talking about, but Bowmaster I don't think is particularly impactful in the mirror, which is funny because we got a video in the last league of double Bowmaster. Archmage is charming our Dimir opponent for a lethal Bowmaster shot on their upkeep. But still, if we didn't have Archmage's Charm, they were going to just run us over with the Murktide Regent. Still don't think Bowmaster is that impactful. So I wouldn't spend all your time fighting over it. Now, if your opponent does go for like an end-of-turn Bowmaster and you have a Stern Scolding, just Stern Scolding it. Don't let a card rot in your hand with no target. Take the 1-for-1. Okay, we'll get on to the next matchup. Ruby Storm, another one of these really fun matchups. If you haven't seen any of the previous Ruby Storm matches, the rule of 2. Everything in your opponent's deck that matters costs 2. Ral, Ruby Medallion, the Rituals, Manamorphose, all the Reckless Impulse, Ren's Resolve cards, the things they need to actually win the game, all cost 2. So taking that into account, Spell Snare, easily your best card in the matchup. Sideboarding, Ruby Storm's likely to not board in too terribly much because they are a Wish deck. So kind of like Karn the Great Creator has a Karn board for you to go get all your targets for that. Ruby Storm's a Wish board. So a lot of one-ofs just kind of stay in the sideboard. If you're running up against... Pay attention to what Surveil lands your opponent's getting game 1. If they're getting Elegant Parlors, so the white Surveil land, they're more likely to board into things like Orum's Chant or Flage or Static Prison. If they're getting the green red one, um, Commercial District, I think's the name, then you're more likely to see things like Veil of Summer post board. So keep an eye on that. That'll help inform some of your sideboarding decisions. It really doesn't change that much either way, but if your opponent's more likely to bring in Flage, or if you actually see Flage, I wouldn't really respect Flage until you've seen Flage. Because a lot of cards that hit Flage are mid against the rest of the deck. So don't respect Flage until you've seen Flage. Sideboard against Ruby Storm. Consigned to Memory, I think, is like okay. It can be really good if your opponent goes for a Wish Galvanic Relay to try to set up for the next turn. It can be okay into an early Grape Shot for value. The problem is, if your opponent's got enough mana to go off and Grape Shot you for lethal and enough Storm count, and you consign to memory the Storm trigger on the Grape Shot, they probably have enough to keep going and Grape Shot again. So like just flashback and Past in Flames, Grape Shot you again. So don't think consigned to memory is like this one card auto win against Storm. Now, it does look a lot better against cards like Empty the Warrens, and it can hit Ruby Medallion. But do remember that we already have 2 consigns in the main. You don't really want to board in another copy for a lot of what-if scenarios. I will board in Surgical. I will board in like maybe 1 copy between Hearse and Nihil Spellbomb, just to respect Past in Flames. So like usually a Spellbomb because it's less mana intensive. But I'm not going to board in 2 Surgicals plus a Spellbomb plus a Hearse and just try to go in on stopping Past in Flames, because a lot of times sideboarding, they're cutting back on their reliance on Past in Flames. So you don't want to just like play into their cutback. The only other consideration I would make is Toxic Deluge if you think your opponent is boarding into a bunch of like Empty the Warrens, or if they're showing a willingness to wish for Empty. So one of the popular things that would happen in the old Storm matchups, back when Gift Storm was around, is your opponent would board in like 3 copies of Empty the Warrens, and they'd have a lot of turn 2s where they just go like Ritual, Manamorphose, Empty the Warrens for 8 goblins, go. And if you don't respect that, you can very easily get got. So Deluge is a potential answer to help stop that scenario. Usually I prefer to recognize when I need to fight over early rituals or like Ral or something, and kind of stop the chain before it really gets rolling. So I'm less likely to board in Deluge, but every now and then I'll find a Storm opponent that's just like boarding in for Empty the Warrens, and then I want access to it. Out of the main, going out, I might board out a Consign, definitely boarding out a Harbinger. The Consign, kind of for the same reason as I mentioned, not really bringing the extra one in, is one is kind of okay-ish, but not great. If I want to keep the Consign in, I'll just board out like double Shoot the Sheriff or something. Like, my sideboarding against Ruby Storm is very, very minimal, just because I think that the entire game plan kind of revolves around not letting them get a big chain of spells started and recognizing that rule of 2. So what your opponent actually has the ability to do at any specific point in the game. And I think I'll spend the next like minute or 2 going over that, because I think it's a lot more important than all of your sideboarding. Like, sideboarding against Storm, it's good to have an idea of what you want to bring in and bring out, whatnot. But I think play pattern recognition against Storm is exponentially more valuable. So let's say turn 2, your opponent casts a ritual, and you've got a spell snare, a force negation, uh, maybe a spell pierce or something, and you're trying to decide what you want to do. And refer back to that rule of 2. My opponent is ritualing up to 3 mana. 3 mana. That means that they have the mana to play 1 spell. Rule of 2. 1 spell. Now I have the option to wait and see what my opponent does, because either they do one of 3 things. Either they put a draw spell on the stack, so like a Rin's Resolve, which makes no sense because they shouldn't have gone for the ritual first to cast a Rin's Resolve. So I can kind of scratch that off of the equation. They go for another ritual effect, which I can counter that, and I've essentially gotten a free ritual out of their hand because now they've cast the first ritual, they've gone for the second one, I've countered that, they've got 1 mana left over, can't do anything, rule of 2. Their turn's over. I've gotten 2 rituals out of hand instead of countering that first one and letting them keep the second one in hand. Or they go for a mana reducer, like a Ral or a Ruby Medallion. In which case, if I've got the spell snare, I can still counter it. Stop the entire chain there. It does get a little bit dicier when, say, you've got a spell pierce and your opponent casts that first ritual and you let it resolve, and then they cast like a Ral, because you can counter a spell if they try to follow the Ral with a 2-drop. But if they flip the Ral, you got to deal with that. So Ral is usually pretty high up on my list of cards to actually counter. If I've got like the mana to spell pierce plus fatal push, I might let them resolve the Ral, cast the ritual, respond to the ritual with fatal push the Ral, and then counter the ritual or something like that. Or fatal push the Ral, let them resolve the ritual to try to start that chain over, go up to 3 mana, put a 2 mana spell on the stack, and then spell pierce that, and essentially I've gotten a free card out of hand. But like, Storm is so dependent on their resources, so just trying to whittle down any extra card you can get out of hand when you can get it is a very, very big deal. Don't forget that Psychic Frog draws a card when you hit a Planeswalker. So in early Psychic Frog, you can be a little more lenient about letting your opponent flip a Ral and then just like ditch some cards to it and kill the Ral. Yeah, that's kind of about it for that matchup. Just stop them from getting an obsessive amount of mana. Surgical Extraction coming in. My biggest surgical targets are usually the rituals. So if my opponent casts like an early Desperate Ritual and follow it up with a Ral and I spell snare the Ral and they pass, I'll probably surgical the Desperate Rituals. It's like there's a decent chance it'll get my opponent to stop being able to have an explosive turn. They don't have any way of getting those back. So sometimes you can just like surgical Desperate or surgical Pyretic, and they kind of lose the ability to go off altogether. Maybe they had another one in hand and they're sitting with like a Past in Flames, and now Past in Flames is dead. The ritual's gone. Yeah, kind of a nice little sequence of events. Good old America control. Red, white, and blue, baby. I miss the days when red, white, and blue control, Jeskai control, before it was named Jeskai, was running like a Johnny Vengeant. And it was a super fun little deck that you'd run into at your occasional F&M, and for whatever reason, people were obsessed with it. But now we've got Jeskai control with Flage and Solitudes and Teferis and blah, 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 blah. A bunch of random, funny stuff. I will admit, Blue-White X control has gotten weirder over the years. It used to be this was like an unwinnable matchup because they just jam 4 Supreme Verdicts and call it a day, and you can't beat that card. Now they're running Wrath of the Skies. And Wrath of the Skies not only being counterable, but almost never being able to hit your Murktide Regent is a really big deal. So now you kind of limit the scope on what you need to fight over. And that does in some ways make it a little bit better, but then they kind of follow it up with the One Ring and Flage and blah, 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 blah. Bunch of annoying cards like that. Sideboarding from their side, they're really likely to bring in Tamiyo. Not so much Surgical. Purge is okay. Hits Frog, hits Bowmaster, doesn't hit Murktide. Murktide's still like the biggest threat, figuratively and literally. Mystical Dispute's definitely coming in. I doubt Invert Polarity's coming in, but I've seen weirder things. They're probably boarding out. Like an Invert. Dress Down's okay. Discharge is okay. Force is okay. A bunch of okay stuff. Not a lot of great stuff. Yeah, probably just a lot of trimming. So let's go to our end. Our end is more exciting. It seems really weird. Consign to Memory, I think, is fantastic against Jeskai. Hits the One Ring. It hits Subtlety and Solitude triggers. If they go for like a Bring Back Flage, you can hit the ETB off that. Not that that's as relevant as Solitude, Subtlety, the One Ring, but I think being able to hit all those pitch elementals plus the ring is like a really, really big deal. Rest of their deck's just like counter spells. So kind of going in on the Orcish Bowmaster plan and making them respect your counters is nice. You could bring in Harbinger. At least according to the list I'm seeing, they don't run a basic mountain. So there's a decent chance Harbinger just like dodges Galvanic Discharge, can't be flaged. The downside is it does still get solituded, so you kind of have to play Harbinger at a time where you've got protection. Might not be worth it. Mystical Dispute, 100% coming in. I will bring in like either Hearse or Spellbomb. I'm probably not bringing in both of them since Flage is the only thing reliant on the graveyard in their deck. But probably bring in like Hearse just because if you hit some stuff and eventually crew it, you might get a nice attack in. Sideboarding out. Spell Pierce, not so great. Hits Teferi on curve, hits the ring on curve, but you do have counter spells and charms and forces that do that same job. Harbinger likely boarding out on my end. And then removal spells, probably board out a couple fatal pushes. So maybe I want to stick or keep Harbinger in or keep Spells Pierce in, something like that. Fatal Push does not hit Solitude, whereas Shoot the Sheriff hits Solitude, Subtlety, and Flage. So Shoot the Sheriff hits everything. Fatal Push does not hit everything. Therefore, Fatal Push gets the axe over Shoot the Sheriff. If you wanted to board in more stuff, let's say you really want to attack the mana base, you could keep in the Harbingers, bring in the other Harbinger, take out all of the Fatal Pushes. And I think that is a perfectly respectable way to approach the matchup as well. Or maybe you want to take out the Spell Pierce or leave in the Spell Pierce and take out what? Let's see. These are my out. These are my in. Maybe leaving the Spell Pierce. Don't bring in the extra consign. Something like that. I wouldn't nitpick too much. really all you're looking to do is keep like Teferi off the board and not put yourself in a position where your opponent just like having a Solitude ruins your entire day. So going all in on a frog in the blind and them just going, oh, Solitude it. Oh, yeah, I gained 7 life and lose. Don't do that. Post board, really be okay with like hitting for 1 off the Psychic Frog. Because if you can keep that like steady stream of cards going, then you can absolutely outvalue your Jeskai opponent really, really easily. Most of their cards kind of suck. Like outside of the One Ring and Teferi and Flage, everything else is pretty bad against us. Also keep in mind that if you flip Tameo is S tier card in this matchup. If you have a lot of Jeskai control in your local meta, I would highly consider going up to a second Tameo. But flip Tameo dodges Wrath of the Skies, dodges Discharge if they don't have more energy to invest, dodges March of Otherworldly Light, dodges Supreme Verdict, dodges Force Negation on the way down, dodges Solitude, dodges Subtlety, dodges Teferi Bounce. Like, you flip your Tameo and they just can't do anything about it. And eventually the ult will win you the game. So if you've got an opening hand with like a Tameo, Bowmaster, Preordain, or whatever, just snap, keep that. Hope your opponent doesn't have a Galvanic Discharge and probably Windmill Slam the Tameo. But other than that, yeah, that's kind of Jeskai for you. Your opening hands, post board, you're really looking for like a cheap counter spell, a way to fight over a Teferi. That's your first big roadblock. A threat. You don't want to get into a late game like counter war with Jeskai, because if they're able to just sandbag a bunch of free spells, they're going to overwhelm whatever you do, regardless of what you do. So if I go to turn 6 and I try to play Murktide, and my opponent goes counterspell, and I go counterspell, and they go Mystical Dispute, and I go Mystical Dispute, and I end up resolving that Murktide, I still have to deal with Solitude. I still have to deal with them untapping with Teferi or the One Ring. I still run the risk of them having Subtlety after all these counterspells resolve. There's just a lot of free stuff or a lot of really impactful stuff that they get to build to. But if I'm able to tax them early, like flash in Bowmaster, make them either fight over it or take a bunch of damage, maybe tap out for a Flage on a turn, I get to resolve Frog plus Mystical Dispute, something like that, that you run a much better option of being able to take that early advantage and really snowball that into a win. Through the Breach. Definitely a much worse matchup for Dimir Murktide than it is for Dimir Shadow. That being said, if they see a bunch of Grove of the Burn Willows, Dimir Shadow can be pretty atrocious against the deck. Sideboarding on their end. Veil of Summer, pretty easy bring in. Trinispheres, okay. Kozilek's Return can be kind of annoying if they have mana available and you want to go for a Harbinger. So you have to keep that in mind. But a lot of the times they won't have red mana just like sitting around ready to go on a turn you want to play a Harbinger. So just keep an eye on like what your opponent's got available. Sideboarding for us. The Eldrazi matchups, I'll kind of throw the Eldrazi matchups together because you've got Through the Breach and you've got Eldrazi Tron. And I think, let's pull up the Through the Breach. I think like enough of the cards overlap that I'm okay putting them in the same kind of category. For example, They're both one ring decks. They've got talismans, Myco Spawn, Devourer, some sort of other Eldrazi value piece, whether it be uh, like Emrakul or something, or Thought Not Seer, 4 Kozilek's Command, 4 All Is Dust. Yeah, I think they're kind of similar enough that I'll throw them together. Your auto includes into the matchup Break the Ice, Consign to Memory, Harbinger of the Seas. Definitely go in regardless of which variation you're playing against. If they're on one of the bigger builds, so Through the Breach, I'm a little more likely to bring in something like Mystical Dispute just as a bad mana leak. It's not great, but being able to fight over like a Through the Breach and then pass turn and still have mana available is really, really nice, assuming you've got like a Harbinger down or you've limited their mana production with Break the Ice. Sideboarding out. Pierce is meh. Spell Snare is meh. Fatal Push is meh. Shoot the Sheriff is meh. So you see a whole bunch of mehs we've got going on here. This is where it kind of depends on what build you're up against. If you're up against one of these like Thought Not Seer builds, Myco Spawn builds or something, then I'm more likely to just board out a couple Fatal Pushes, keep like a couple Shoot the Sheriff and a couple Fatal Push in. So the more Eldrazi heavy build, we'll board out like some Fatal Pushes and stuff. The more spell heavy build, so with like Through the Breach, more likely to board some of that stuff out and keep in some number of Spell Pierce or Spell Snare. Do remember that Spell Pierce, especially on the draw, being able to hit like a turn 2 Trinisphere is really nice. On the play, you can hit a turn 1 Talisman. I do think people don't respect hitting talismans as much as they should, because talisman not only ramps but keeps your opponent off of green or red mana if you're able to find a Harbinger of the Seas. So Spell Snare, Spell Pierce to counter an early talisman can do a whole lot to slow your opponent down on multiple axes. I'm not sure what the word there is. Same thing with like Force Negation on an early talisman. It can also be really nice to like Spell Pierce the talisman, untap, Break the Ice a land, knowing that they can't have green open for Veil of Summer on that turn. Your progression post board against any of the Eldrazi decks, if you don't have a hate piece, and hate piece I think has a fairly broad definition against Eldrazi. Break the Ice, Harbinger of the Seas are kind of like the obvious ones. I would also consider Force of Negation to be a hate piece, Consign to Memory to be a hate piece. But really the top 3, Consign is like you need to have something else going on for Consign to be more than just a counter spell. But the first 3 are kind of like your proactive hate pieces. These are the things you can do regardless of what your opponent's doing. And I'll explain why I say Force. Or I'll explain all of them, but the reason I say Force is because of plays like turn 2 Psychic Frog or turn 3 Jam a Harbinger, hold up Force is a way that you can kind of seal the deal against these decks. But if you don't have a hate piece, don't keep the hand. Like Shadow can really get away with keeping hands that don't have hate pieces, because you can get turn 1 Thoughtseize, turn 2 Thoughtseize Nethergoyf, turn 3 Shadow, Stubborn Denial something, and that can win you a lot of games against Tron without needing a Break the Ice or a Harbinger or something. But with Dimir, if you've got an opening hand of like 2 lands, Preordain, Bowmaster, Counterspell, Archmage's Charm, uh, Spell Snare, something like that, you are going to get run over. Because now you've put yourself in a spot where you need to find a hate piece, you need to find a threat, you need to find more lands, and it looks like that hand looks good in theory, but when you start playing it out, it gets exponentially worse the longer you go on. If you keep a hand with a hate piece, then you still need to find some of those pieces, but you've put a substantial stop on your opponent's ability to kill you or end the game in the meantime. So, like, Break the Ice being a 2-for-1 against an early Ugin's Labyrinth, or taking out an early Temple so they can't Kozilek's Command your Harbinger if you find one, are really big deals. Force Negation, being able to protect the follow-up. So, like, turn 2 Frog, pass. Your opponent plays turn 1 Labyrinth, turn 2 Eldrazi Temple, and goes to Kozilek's Command your Frog, and you can force it, untap, get an extra draw of Frog, try to find another counterspell or a hate piece. Or you play Harbinger on 3, pass, they go to cast a 1 ring, and you get to respond with Force and Negation. Things like that are the sequences you really need to interact profitably with Tron. The trap I think people fall into is that idea of, oh, playing the control deck just means having some good counter spells. Like, if I had an opening hand of 3 lands, 4 consigned to memory. I'm not even running 4 consigned to memory, but let's say I had that. 3 lands, 4 consigned. I would throw that back in a heartbeat because it does not lock my opponent out of anything. It doesn't interact with their resources on the battlefield. It doesn't provide a clock on my end. Get rid of it. Play for something that more proactively impacts the board. And that really needs to be like Harbinger, Break the Ice, Frog plus Force. You can afford to go down to 6 or 5 in the matchup and still have a reasonable chance. What you can't afford to do is keep a 7 that doesn't do anything to stop Tron from just like hard casting their spells one turn after another. Amulet Titan. Definitely a popular matchup in the modern leagues online. So one you certainly need to have some sort of a game plan for. Post board, Amulet Titan likely bringing in things like Bojuka Bog, Dismember maybe, Endurance for sure. Dismember mostly if they're expecting Harbinger of the Seas, which I'm sure all of them are at this point. Sideboarding out could be things like Summoner's Pact, Explore, maybe the Aftermath combo, maybe not. I wouldn't be shocked if they're boarding out on the Aftermath combo against Dimir, just because of stuff like Harbinger being a shutdown card for it. Maybe trimming a couple of the lands to bring in Bojuka Bog and whatnot. But Endurance is usually like the big thing that I think about when I play against Amulet Titan. Everything else is kind of roll with it. If it happens, it happens, like Bojuka Bog. For us, Surgical, certainly one of the big ones you think about, because if you're able to stop Titan, stop the 1 ring, that can certainly help out your game plan quite a bit. Harbinger of the Seas, Consigned to Memory. Consigned not only hitting Amulet itself or the 1 ring, but hitting an ETB trigger off of a Primeval Titan can be a big deal. There's also some really funny random turns where your opponent will go like search trigger off Urza Saga. It's another big one. But some funny turns where your opponent goes like turn 1, land Amulet, turn 2, play a bounce land, and you can sign the Amulet trigger, especially on the draw. And they still have to pick up the land and kind of reset themselves for a turn. And that can buy you into counterspell range for turn 2, maybe like Harbinger for turn 3. But it just acts as like a 1-mana time walk against Amulet bounce land. So keep that in mind as something that you have access to. Break the Ice. I've been on and off of Break the Ice. Usually I'll bring it in because I feel like I've got enough stuff to cut. Realistically, thinking of targets for it, Urza's Saga is probably the biggest. Other than that, Crumbling Vestige, Echoing Deeps, Handwear Battlements, Mirror Pool. But these are all a bunch of cards that they're going to be searching for off Titan, Mycosynth Gardens. But there's a reasonable chance that they have one or two in their opening hand, and Break the Ice targeting those is relevant. But mostly it's for Urza Saga. Stop constructs, stop them just finding another One Ring. The board outs. Spell Snare is usually a pretty free cut. It does hit Analyst. It does hit Explore, but these are things I'm kind of expecting them to cut on post board. Not so much Explore, but more Analyst. But Spell Snare, Orcish Bowmaster, Fatal Push, some number of these things. Maybe you want to keep in Bowmasters, board out pushes. Where's my other frog? Come back here, frog. Something like this post board. You could trim Counterspell if you're really worried about Cavern of Souls, but I'm not even sure all Amulet lists are running Cavern of Souls anymore. I'm sure most of like the experienced Amulet players have one in their 75, but a lot of times you get into these metas where people that are picking up the deck just kind of say like, oh, I don't run into Counterspells. I'm not running Cavern. So they're probably going to have it. A lot of times there's not much you can do about it. Keep up with what your opponent's doing post board. So you're going to have times where like they haven't played a land drop for a couple turns and then they packed for a Titan and you have to decide, all right, am I countering the pact or am I countering the Titan? Well, if they haven't played a land for a few turns, I'm probably countering the Titan because I'm expecting them to not have a Cavern of Souls. But if they've played a land every turn, then maybe I'm more likely to counter the pact because they could just have a Cavern in hand and be ready to play it out. So things like that. Most of the progressions in the early game, be aggressive about stopping a turn 1 Amulet. So if you've got Pierce or Force Negation or Consign to Memory for a turn 1 Amulet, be willing to fight over that. Oh, Spell Pierce. Spell Pierce, I probably boarding out on the draw, keeping in on the play. I might keep in like Fatal Push or something on the draw over Spell Pierce because it does interact with the Analyst, Azusa, Dryad, Construct tokens. It's not great, but it's like better than Spell Pierce, specifically on the draw. But on the play, I'm definitely keeping in Spell Pierce and boarding out Fatal Push. Pierce also hits Spelunking, if that's a consideration for you. So you could easily make the argument of boarding out the Fatal Pushes, keeping in the Spell Pierces on the play and the draw. But I'm just going off of my opinion. What was I saying? Oh, keep Amulet off the board early. Saga is very, very annoying. If you can stop a search trigger with a Consign, really good. If you can break the ice, it really good. Frog, excellent threat to get down early. Usually don't have a lot of interaction for it. Quick Murktide. If you can play out a Murktide as like a 4-4 or a 5-5 early with a way to stop your opponent from just destroying you if you do. So a Force Negation or like a Consign to Memory or something like that, do it. Get a clock going. That is the best thing you can possibly do against Amulet Titan is get an actual threat down, start attacking, and try to use that tempo advantage to just race them for a couple turns. Kind of like with Jeskai Control, what you don't want to do, or with Tron, what you don't want to do is sit back with a couple counter spells and say, oh, this is enough for me to find pressure and close the game out. It's not. It's not. More often than not, they are just going to run you over by getting to a point where they can cast a big spell like a One Ring, a Primeval Titan and Analyst or something every turn. And that's really going to put pressure on your counter spells, especially if you've been using your counter spells to interact with things like Amulet and Dryad or whatever early on in the game. So, post board, when you're thinking of your mulligan decisions, you really need to think about looking for hands that have like a piece of interaction and a threat and a way to get that threat online. Don't keep a Murktide with 3 fetches, 2 counter spells, and I don't know, an Archmage's Charm or something, because that's not a proactive threat. That relies on your opponent casting stuff that A, you want to counter, and B, you will counter just to get the Murktide online. But a hand with like Psychic Frog, Break the Ice, Counter Spell, a couple fetches, Fatal Push, like that's a pretty good hand because it allows you to see what's going on turn 1, maybe fetch up an Undercity Sewers to filter a draw. Turn 2, if your opponent didn't do anything crazy, you can play Frog. If they did, you can play Break the Ice, and kind of snowball from there. Yeah, I guess that's about it for the Amulet matchup. Be proactive. Domain Zoo time. Domain has been picking up a lot of popularity in recent weeks, which is really cool to see. I think it's a super fun deck. It has a lot of the feel of kind of old school Shadow, where you get to drop down a really big threat really early, put a lot of pressure on your opponent to answer it, back it up with like cheap removal, stubborn denial. Always going to be a stubborn denial fan. So interesting deck to see back in the format. Sideboarding, they really don't have too much to bring in for this particular matchup, so you're kind of looking more at the main deck stuff. Territorial Kavu, really big consideration. Leyline into Scion of Draco, or Leyline into Leyline Binding. Really big pieces to keep in mind. Really, the 2 things that you care about in the deck are Scion of Draco and Leyline Binding. Scion of Draco being a threat that you just cannot answer if they have a Binding down or they have a Leyline of the Guild Pack down without having like Sink into Stupor for the Leyline and to Kill Spell for the Scion, which you only run usually a couple copies to Shoot the Sheriff. A bunch of the other smaller creatures you can stonewall with Frog pretty easily, but Leyline Binding can cause some problems there, so just be a little careful. Sideboarding for us against Zoo. Consign seems like one that you wouldn't initially have on your radar, but it is one of the only ways that we can answer a Scion coming down, especially turn 2 when we're on the draw with a Leyline of the Guild Pact. So having an out to that is really nice. I'll usually board in 1, maybe 2 copies of Toxic Deluge, but at least 1, just because it is the only way in the 75 to kill a Scion of Draco with a Leyline of the Guild Pact down without having to first bounce the Leyline of the Guild Pact. So it's just an out. I've had it come up multiple times that I've deluged away a Scion. It does happen. It does work. Keep the option there. Unfortunately, Leyline of the Guild Pack does say that their threats aren't like all creature types or all colors or whatever until they're on the battlefield. So you can't Mystical Dispute like a Kavu on the stack for 1 mana. Otherwise, I would say bring in Mystical Dispute. Harbinger of the Seas can come in. Now, I will talk about Harbinger of the Seas. There's more to it than just auto bring in the card. So we'll get to that momentarily. Sideboarding out. Pierce is pretty bad. Leyline of the Guild Pact makes Leyline Binding 1 mana. So a lot of times they're going to have the ability to pay for Spell Pierce. And then like Bowmasters isn't great because a lot of their threats are going to outgrow the Bowmasters. If you're on the play, you could bring or keep the Spell Pierces in and just board out more Bowmasters. If you're more concerned about Ragavan, you can keep the Bowmasters in, board out the Spell Pierces. You see how with Dimir, it's a lot of what are you expecting? What are you wanting to play around? For me, I don't think Ragavan's that big of a deal for most hands. So I'm more likely to board out the Bowmasters and keep the Spell Pierce in. That way I've got an answer to like a Tribal Flames or like double 2-drop turns, or a turn where they might want to go like 2-drop plus Stubborn Denial. I can use Spell Pierce to fight over that. They are a pretty land light deck, so the likelihood of them getting to like 4, 5, 6 mana to be able to double spell and pay for Spell Pierce is fairly low. Bowmasters, I don't think kills anything outside of exactly Ragavan. Otherwise, it's just a chump blocker. But with cards like Scion of Draco flying, Neshoba Brawler having trample, Territorial Kavu having the attack trigger, they don't really mind attacking into chump blockers. I said Harbinger of the Seas is a board in, but it's not just like a windmill slam card. Kind of the same thing as Boros. If your opponent is representing, they can get their basic mountain, you probably don't want to slam Harbinger into that. So if they just got a red fetch land up, and they can go get mountain for like Bolt or Tribal Flames, that's a pretty big deal. Leyline Binding. Getting white for Leyline Binding is a little less scary, because if you Harbinger into, let's say they have Leyline of the Guild packed out, you Harbinger, they've got basic planes, they essentially get 1 mana of any color every turn. So if you're able to, say, force a negation or consign to memory the Leyline Binding, the first one to target the Harbinger, then there's a good chance you're going to be able to untap and interact with 1 spell per turn. Sometimes they won't have a spell because, like, they can't play Scion, or they can play Scion off 2 mana. They can't play Kavu off of just 1 mana of any color. They can play like Neshoba Brawler, stuff like that. But more than likely, it's going to be limited to 1 card per turn cycle, and that very favorably pushes the ball into your court. So being able to Harbinger is nice, but Harbingering into basic mountain means they're more likely to be able to like bolt your Harbinger if they don't have a ley line out. So take into account whether or not they have a ley line, then take into account whether or not they can get a basic when they have their ley line. There's probably like 50 rule of thumbs you could write up for that scenario, but I'll try to sum it up. If they have a ley line of the Guild Pact, try to Harbinger when they can't get a basic land, and that'll just turn everything into islands. If they don't have a ley line and they don't have a basic out and they're like tapped out, windmill slam the Harbinger. If they do have a basic, you would rather it be a basic plains than a basic mountain. If they have the ability to get a basic plains, then play out the Harbinger if you have a way to stop the Leyline Binding right then and there. So like a consign for the Leyline ETB trigger, or counter spell up, something like that, spell pierce if they're low on mana, whatever the case may be. But if you do, also remember, if they've got, say, 3 lands, 2 non-basics and a basic plains, and you cast a Harbinger, they can't float mana, let the Harbinger resolve, and then play the Leyline Binding for a reduced cost. So if you've got 2 lands, basic plains, you resolve a Harbinger, they float, or you cast Harbinger, they float their 3 mana or whatever, you resolve Harbinger, that Leyline Binding is reduced by 2. It's these basic plains and islands. So it still costs 4. They can't cast it with 3 mana. So knowing that interaction could be the difference between like windmill slamming a Harbinger early, or waiting to try to play around a Leyline Binding that you didn't need to play around because they couldn't actually cast it in that scenario. So you'll have games where your opponent goes for like turn 2 Kavu plus fetch land for white card, and you end a turn, kill the Kavu, and then untap and just play the Harbinger. Maybe they get like a Sacred Foundry and bolt the Harbinger. Tough luck. You're just playing to the odds at that point. What else? What else? Post board. 1-drops, you don't care about that much, especially if it's Wild Nacatl. The 2-drops are a lot better. So like Fatal Push, held on for the 2-drops, shoot the Sheriff. Scion of Draco, if you can fight it on the stack, you really want to do that. Be careful of Stubborn Denial, because if you let a threat resolve and then try to kill it, there's a better chance of Stubborn Denial being impactful. But if you try to counter it on the stack and then they have Stubborn Denial, then you can just pay the 1 and negate that. So it's definitely a deck that values having a threat on the board. Even if that threat's not attacking, just having it on the board makes cards like Stubborn Denial a lot more impactful. Also, keep note of sequences like cast Flage, Flage trigger on the stack, cast a Leyline Binding with a Stubborn Denial up, because then you got to know that Stubborn Denial is active, ready to go. So maybe sometimes in situations like that, it's right to fetch and Fatal Push the Flage before you respond to the Leyline Binding with a counter spell. You can also kill the Flage in response to the Stubborn Denial, or kill the threat in response to the Stubborn Denial, and then you just have to pay the 1. It doesn't check that payment until the spell resolves. Anything else about... Not really much else about the Zoo. Like, most of their deck is playing to the board, so you're not really as worried about them aggressively escaping Flage over and over again. It can happen, but for a deck that just sees like a couple creatures to play out, Leyline's never going to the board. Leyline to the Guild Pact or Leyline Binding are never going to the board more often than not. I'm not too worried about Flage. Just Scion of Draco. That's the one you got to keep off the board and be careful about. Next up, we got Living End, matchup that typically don't see as much of anymore now that Violent Outburst is out of the format, but still one you can run into from time to time. And unfortunately, with the loss of Violent Outburst and a little bit less reliant on cards like Force Negation, you do still run into very interactive builds of Living End with things like Colossal Sky Turtle, a lot of number of like Otawaras, Sink into Stupor getting added in, Commandeer. So don't think that it's just like a free sorcery speed counterspell kind of matchup. Like, oh, I just counter their Living End on their turn and the game's over. Like, no, there's more going on than that. Substantially more. Teferi, Mystical Dispute, probably the 2 biggest hitters out of the sideboard that you got to keep an eye on. Leyline of the Void, like okay into Murktide, not really good into Frog, but it is relevant, so you at least need to pay attention to things like that existing. Force of Vigor into some of your removal spells. Their side outs could be anything from like some of the jankier cycle creatures. Never even seen this card before. Some number of the Cascade spells, something like that coming out. But for our side, there's 2 levels to the matchup, or I'll say 3 levels. Level 1 is countering the actual Living Ends. That's like your first priority, is making sure the Living End doesn't resolve. Or if it does, you're in a position to where it doesn't matter. Number 2
is fighting over their protection for their living ends. So that's like fighting over mystical disputes. Less so force negation, since they can't force on their own turn unless they're just hard casting. Or things like commandeer. And then level 3 is fighting over them actually hard casting creatures. Because if you sit there with a handful of like spell pierces and whatever else, spell pierce, consign to memory, uh, and they just start like hard casting endurances and curators, then you're going to have a problem. So you really can't go all in on one route and kind of ignore the others. Things I'm bringing in for sure: consigned to memory counters cascade trigger off their cascade spells. So it's a pretty nice one to have access to. Mystical Dispute fights over their counter magic really well. Surgical Extraction takes living ends out of the equation. Hearse, Nihil Spellbomb. Any number of these 7 can come in for sure. Toxic Deluge is kind of on the plan C route. Like if they start hard casting creatures, then hard casting a Toxic Deluge to kind of reset the board can be effective. I would look at that more as something like on the draw than the play. Cards I'm interested in boarding out: Harbinger of the Seas, not very effective. Bowmaster, way back when, right before the Lord of the Rings set, or right after the Lord of the Rings set dropped, Living End hadn't really adopted a bunch of the land cycler guys yet. So it was a lot nicer to be able to flash in your Bowmaster in response to some of the draw spells. Now they're on like 8 to 12 copies of land cyclers and Waker of Waves and things that don't actually say draw a card, which makes Orcish Bowmaster exponentially worse. Fatal Push in some number can come out kind of really ineffective against a lot of the hard cast guys if it goes that route. Doesn't do anything if it doesn't go that route. So a little bit of like worst of all the available options. And then Spell Snare, they literally don't have anything in their deck that costs 2. So some number of these 9 for some number of like these 8 or so. If you want to try to cheese out your opponents with like land drops and hope they don't see the generous int to get their basic forest or something like that, you can give it a shot. I don't think it's a very consistent plan, but you could just keep in your Harbinger, even bring in the extra Harbinger if you don't want to cut as much. Like maybe you want to keep another Bowmaster in and board in these 8. Then you could just board out these. Kind of see what I mean? If that makes sense. If you just really want like these cards out, then you could look at something like the Harbinger from the side coming in. Keep your Harbinger in the deck. Maybe don't board in the Toxic Deluge. You kind of have to play around with it a bit to come up with a plan that you like or you think works well for you. It all kind of comes down to what you're okay losing to or what you're okay not having function optimally. I feel like that's not the best way of putting it. It all comes down to what avenue you're okay losing to. It's like you're never going to be able to cover everything. You can't have a quick frog or a quick Murktide and hope to clock them, because if they have a sky turtle, that plan just goes out the window. You can't have a like counter heavy plan and not have a clock, because then you just lose to them, like I said, starting to just hard cast creatures. You can't go all in on just your Grave Hate, because that doesn't deal with hard cast creatures, and they're likely to board in Force Negations, Artifact and Enchantment Hate to be able to fight over like Unlicensed Hearse and Nihil Spellbomb. So, yeah. For me, I like to say I'm not going to die to a resolved living end, and I'm going to try my best to not die to hard cast creatures. Now, if you just like fight on the stack more, you'll probably win it. I'm not going to worry so much about having a threat down right away and hope for the best, but that's just me personally. Surgical can do a good job of like getting the living end issue off the table completely. So if you are relying heavily on surgical, say you want to board minimally, I would say something like the 2 surgicals and probably 2 mystical dispute, and just say I'm going to throw, if I find surgical in like my opening hand or something, I'm going to throw everything I've got at that first living end and then try to surgical it. And that kind of makes what, 8 or so cards out of their deck dead, 7, 8. All the Shardless Agents and the Ardent Pleas. If you go that route, then I would just say board out like the Spell Snares because they literally don't hit anything, and then like a Fatal Push. This way you get to keep in the most removal possible for hard cast creatures while taking out the cards that are like explicitly dead against your opponent. Yeah. Pick a route you like there. Go with that. Goryo's Vengeance. Definitely a matchup that I think is fairly fun. I do think the Goryo's deck like grinds a lot better than people give it credit for. I think the versions with the Emperor of Bones are a little bit better against us just because they have a little more incidental hate. Like they play around removal spells a little bit better. They play around counter spells a little bit better. So they can just kind of sit on the board, pick off some cards in the graveyard, and threaten to activate. So keep that in mind. The biggest board ends, Nihil Spellbomb, extra Psychic Frog in this case, Teferi, Time Reveler, Force Negation, any of those are pretty significant. Not really worried about Wrath of the Skies or Subtlety, Deluge, Consign, Dranith Magistrate. Stuff they're likely boarding out. Ephemerate, I think, is a little bit weaker. You're probably keeping a couple copies in, but maybe trimming on Ephemerate. Prismatic Ending is okay. Archaeologist is probably staying in. So yeah, I'd just say trimming on like Ephemerate, Prismatic Ending. Maybe Thoughtseize, but not too likely. Could even say trim on Force Negation, but I doubt that's truly a winning line for them. But on our end, naturally being a pressure plus counterspell deck, we have a lot of game against Goryo's. Game 1, Game 2, and 3, we've got access to not only like some great Grave Hate options with Surgical, Nihil, and Unlicensed Hearse, but we have like Mystical Dispute to fight on the stack over their draw spells, Stern Scolding. If they're only on Archaeologist Frog, I'm probably not bringing in Stern Scolding, but if I see Archaeologist Frog and Emperor, then I definitely am bringing in Stern Scolding. I wouldn't fault you for bringing them in if you don't see Emperor. I think that it's still a pretty good card to have access to against Frogs, Solitudes, whatnot. But I just don't care that much about Solitude, Ephemerate if they're just throwing it into like a 1-for-1 trade. Or 2-for-1 really, because I put one creature down, they Solitude, Ephemerate, and they're just not going to exile another creature because I'm not going to put another creature in front of that. So We'll go like these 6 kind of for sure, Stern Scolding and kind of the maybe pile. Stuff I'm sideboarding out. Shoot the Sheriff is a little weak. I've seen some people go with the plan of like, I'm going to consign to memory, say the Atraxa ETB, and then shoot the Sheriff the Atraxa or something like that. I really don't like that plan. I really like putting more effort into stopping the Atraxa from hitting the battlefield in the first place. I think that the Harbinger plan's pretty weak because they can fetch out basic swamp really easily, really proactively. Just not a very effective method of attack. Consigned to memory. Again, not a big fan of trying to hit the Atraxa trigger, shoot the Sheriff. The other sideboard outs. I'd probably look towards Fatal Push first. Like, yeah, they can have Psychic Frog, but we do have a couple more pushes. We have Spell Snares. We have Mystical Dispute. Stern Scolding if you want that in. So some number of these cards. And then you could look at something like Archmage's Charm if you want to get more more lean. Like boarding out Archmage's Charm for one of the cheaper counterspell options, I think is perfectly reasonable. Spell Pierce if you're more worried about the game going longer. You can board out Spell Pierce for one of these other interaction options. Or if you see your opponent's on like Archaeologist, Psychic Frog, Emperor of Bones, and like the black-white reanimate dude, the priest, then maybe you want to drop the Spell Pierces and go back in for more like counters that can hit the creatures. Spell Pierce, though, is going to be really good against like the Tainted Indulgence effects as well as Goryo's Vengeance a lot of the time if they try to go for it early. The problem is in the matchup, they typically don't have an opportunity to go for a combo early, so they have to play kind of a medium to long game, which makes Spell Pierce worse as the game goes on. So kind of try to get a read on your opponent. If they're the kind of player that goes for the Goryo's Vengeance aggressively, then keeping Spell Pierce in can do a really good job for you. If they're not, then I'd probably drop it and try to bring in something that's going to play a little bit of a longer game for you. Other than that, yeah, like try to hold up interaction the first few turns. Don't jam a frog onto and let your opponent just like freely resolve their own frog. Because if you board out some amount of removal and get into a frog war, your opponent's got the significant advantage on that. Not only because they're likely to have more cards that they're happy to discard. So like discarding Atraxa, discarding Gristlebrand, Ulamog, something like that is all kind of positive in their book. But also they don't care about their frogs surviving and attacking at that point. So if you get into a little frog on frog violence situation and you start like attacking and trying to discard to grow your frog and they're discarding to grow their frog, they don't actually care if their frog wins. They just want to like run you out of resources because at that point you've kind of committed to, okay, I'm going to try to kill your frog. At which point all they have to do is make sure they're left with like Agoria's Vengeance in hand and nothing else really matters. So be careful in those spots. I know I've run into that exact situation before where I've tried to like attack into my opponent's frog and they were just like, oh yeah, here, ditch my whole hand. I don't care. Yeah, that's about all I got for that one. So let's head up. Yeah, let's head on to the next one. All right, I think we're gonna do like 5 more matchups, and I'm gonna kind of jump around a little bit to pick some decks that I think are a little more popular, especially online at the moment. So if you're scrolling down Goldfish, like looking for matchups, and I skipped a few of them, that's probably why. So Hollow One, Definitely picking up some popularity on Magic Online. You've got Fear of Missing Out coming out in the new Duskmourn set that is also going to make this matchup a little more popular. Because having a two drop red creature that gives you extra combat steps with Detective's Phoenix is going to be something that you really need to look out for. So, some of the big considerations against Hollow One. Blood Moon out of the sideboard, Graveyard Trespasser can be kind of annoying. But really, it's just a fair-ish red-black mid-range deck. And that's kind of how you have to treat it. You're not going to have a lot of silver bullet options for the deck. It's going to be a lot of just trying to get some incremental value. Frog into like Burning Inquiry or Lightning Bolt hands can be really, really good. Bowmaster into Inquiry or opposing Goblin Lores can often act as like a pseudo Wrath effect. So from their end, let's say they bring in Blood Moon Trespasser. That's about all I would consider. Probably boarding out like some number of Lightning Bolts. Maybe like a couple Goblin Lores. Not really a whole lot to board out. On our side, I don't really like the Harbinger of the Seas playing in the matchup. Don't like Consigned to Memory just for Hollow One. Unlicensed Hearse, Nihil Spellbomb are both great. Stern Scolding is decent. Stern Scolding might get a little bit better with Fear of Missing Out coming into play because it does hit Channeler, Orcish Bowmaster, Hardcast Detective's Phoenix, but not Bestowed Detective's Phoenix. Remember that Bestowed Detective's Phoenix is an enchantment on the stack, not a creature. Stern hits Fear of Missing Out. If they're running the one drop, one red dude from Amonkhet that gets bigger when you discard cards, stuff like that makes Stern Scolding better. Surgical Extraction is fine. It kind of depends on the variant to me. If they're on Fear of Missing Out, I'm more likely to bring in Surgical Extraction because hitting a Detective's Phoenix can be a really big deal. If they're not on Fear of Missing Out, then hitting Phoenix is still okay, but I really don't want to waste like another spot for that when we already have a bunch of big creatures that can fly with Psychic Frog and Murktide Regent. So more likely than not, I'm just boarding in like Hearse and Spellbomb. Again, not really planning on Harbinger. They have too many basic mountains. Sign, no, Dispute. Stern Scolding still like iffy. We'll put it in like, we'll put Stern Scolding and Surgical Extraction in like the maybe pile. Like I would consider those, but they're not as high up on my priority list. Sideboarding out. Harbinger, very likely coming out. Consigned to Memory, I'm cutting. I know it can counter a Hollow One, but chances are if they go like Burning Inquiry on turn 1, you're just not going to get to cast it. And anytime after that, you really don't have time to sit around and wait for it. Spell Pierce can be a little meh. Whereas Archmage's Charm can be a little slow. It's honestly about it. So you could go like Harbinger, Consigns, a Spell Pierce, a Charm, or just a Charm. Keep a Spell Pierce if you're more concerned for like Goblin Lore, Blood Moon. Don't bring in the Stern Scoldings, just bring in all of your Grave Hate. Try to hit Detective's Phoenix. Ox of Agonis out of the yard is a fine hit. Try to hold up Bowmasters for turns they might go for Goblin Lore. Spell Pierce, Burning Inquiry, Goblin Lore, Blood Moon. Really like your entire game plan is just get a Murktide down. Like, get a big Murktide, and you can deal with a lot of stuff. Get a big Murktide, plan on counterspelling a late game Detectives Phoenix, and yeah, you can kind of rock and roll from there. It's not a particularly rough matchup, but it always comes down to Burning Inquiry, right? Because if you're on the draw and your opponent casts a turn 1 Inquiry, you have to decide, one, if you have a Force Negation, do you want to use it? If you don't have it, then there's a chance that they can just make you discard all your lands and you lose the game on the spot, and there's nothing you could have done about it. I would not recommend aggressively mulliganing for something like Force Negation, because if you go down and don't see it, then Burning Inquiry risks just like ruining that hand even more. So I would just, as long as your opening hand has got a couple lands, I would kind of leave it up to fate at that point. If the higher magic powers decide that you were not meant to play that game, then you'll discard everything relevant, and they'll keep triple hollow one in hand and GLHF. If you want to go the Deluge route, you can. It's a lot better on the draw than it is on the play, which sounds kind of counterintuitive. But on the play, with like Spell Pierce and Bowmaster and stuff like that, you're way more interested in casting those into your opponent's Burning Inquiry and Goblin Lore. On the draw, you're kind of playing out some chump blockers if they do get down a quick hollow one and hoping to deluge away the board. But I really don't think Deluge is that effective of a plan to begin with, because you run the risk of your opponent just following it up with like a Nethergoyf plus a Phoenix and killing you. So taking a couple hits and having to pay a bunch of life for Deluge is really just not a very effective strategy into them. Twiddle Storm, deck that has put up results sporadically through the last few years. Every now and then some Twiddle Storm list will just like make its way into a top 8, but I know it did have a couple decent finishes pretty recently. Like 9th and 6th in the challenge, 9th in another challenge, another challenge top 8. So Nathan and the Guilt Leaf have just been like wrecking challenges with Twiddle Storm, which is kind of funny. So it's a deck that's nice to have just like a generic plan for. The twiddle down your lands aspect of the deck, if they're trying to set up for like a One Ring or an Underworld Breach, can be really annoying. Sideboard, the only thing they have that's really coming in aggressively is like Defense Grid. Maybe they bring in like Into the Flood Maw, but that's very whatever-ish. It's really just Defense Grid that you care about. The extra breach staying in the side is a wish target. So yeah, probably boarding in like 2 Defense Grids, 2 Into the Flood Maw to be able to wish for the extra copies if need be. Boarding out maybe like an extra breach or something, and consigns. I guess you got to keep some number of consigning for Lotus Field. Okay, so things to keep an eye out for post-board against Twiddle Storm. I guess we'll shift around our sideboard first, and then we'll talk about some play patterns. Things that I do want in: Harbinger of the Seas, really solid because it does turn Lotus Field into just like a 1 mana make 1, or not 1 mana make 1, just a land that makes 1. I would really try to set up Harbinger of the Seas. So like wait for them to or play their Lotus Field, sack the other lands, fight over the untap effects, and then untap and play a Harbinger, because you can probably cut them down to just like 1, maybe 2 mana at that point. Whereas if you play it before the Lotus Field, you risk them being able to play out the Lotus Field untapped and then have 3 mana to just deal with the Harbinger like a Into the Flood Maw and have an untapped Lotus Field in play that they didn't have to sack lands for. So do be careful of that. Other sideboard stuff to board out. Mystical Dispute can come out pretty easily. Some of your grave hates like Unlicensed Hearse, Nihil Spellbomb, Surgical Extraction, Consign is fine. I usually board in pretty heavy against Twiddle Storm because like the Fatal Pushes and the Shoot the Sheriffs are completely dead. These do absolutely nothing for you whatsoever. So really interested in shaving all of those if possible. Spell Snare only hits Hidden Strings and Underworld Breach. It's okay, I guess. It's not great. The Consigns are probably like the weakest of the potential board-in options. But I'd probably just look at like Spell Snare being the next cut. Bowmaster is decent into all the draw spells. Any of your hard counter magic to fight over like the One Ring is really nice. Or just they spend 3 for a Wish. You spend 3 for an Archmage's Charm. Call it a day. Yeah. Targets you want to fight over. Obviously, One Ring, Underworld Breach are likely to just end the game. So either one of those you really want to fight over. Expedition map or like a way to find Lotus Field is a pretty free fight. So if you're on the play, your opponent leads on an expedition map, going ahead and using like a Consign to Memory or a Spell Pierce on that can potentially slow things down. The actual Twiddle effects, the tap-untap effects. So Twiddle itself, Hidden Strings, Dream's Grip. If they're just using them to tap down one of your creatures, unless you're killing them, I'm probably just letting it go. It's card disadvantage on their end. They're not tapping down my land. Assuming I still have some sort of interaction for their turn, I'll just let them kind of replace that card. Wish I'm countering more often than not because there's always the chance they put like a Lotus Field in their sideboard, or maybe they go Wish into the Flood Maw or something, and they got to use it. Just remember though that if they do Wish, they have to cast that spell this turn or play that spell. So if you're afraid of like an Into the Flood Maw on your Murktide Regent that turn, and you've got multiple pieces of interaction, then it might be worth it to just let them go ahead and use that Wish and cast the Into the Flood Maw. Because if you counter the Flood Maw, then it might turn out that they have another Wish and they can't go get another one because they boarded 2 in. So kind of play it by ear based off your hand. Or if there's a situation where your opponent's empty-handed and they Wish and they've got a bunch of mana floating off the Lotus Field and you think they're going to get like a One Ring, then, all right, do I have a way to interact with the One Ring? Do I not? Do I need to go off of countering the Wish? Like, it's not always an auto counter the Wish. Sometimes you'll want to set up for making future wishes worse. It depends on, like I said, your hand, your board presence, what your priority is in that matchup. Otherwise, Otawara can be a little annoying. That's kind of about everything for that matchup. Psychic Frog is like best thing you can possibly do. Just jam out a turn 2 Psychic Frog. Do be aware though that now with the introduction of Consign to Memory, they can have turn 1 land, turn 2 Lotus Field, and consign the Lotus Field trigger, which can potentially allow them to just like untap on turn 3 with up to 5 mana with Lotus Field and 2 other lands. So if you don't have a Force Negation, you might not want to jam the Frog on turn 2. If you're on the draw and you have a way to interact with the Consign to Memory, that can be huge. So if your opponent goes Lotus Field, consign the trigger, and you get to like Spell Pierce the Consign to Memory, that's an option to definitely be aware of. Other than that, yeah, we'll just go on to the next match. Good old fish sticks. Merfolk for the people who don't want their Tide Shapers deep fried. Tricky matchup. Really tricky matchup. Sideboard subtleties about the only thing in a list like this that you're really concerned about them bringing in. Tide binders, kind of whatever, can be annoying if they just shut off your frog, but that means that you did get a big frog because they're not blocking it. You got Consign, Stern Scolding. I could imagine a bunch of Merfolk players bringing in Stern Scolding. If you play Merfolk and you're listening to this, I doubt you really need it that badly. You could probably leave it on the sideboard. Force Negation, some number of Flare Denial, Harbinger of the Seas, probably the cuts, like trimming Harbinger. But at the same time, like if you're playing Merfolk, you're gonna try to cheese somebody, so you're probably keeping a bunch of Harbingers in. Our sideboard plan. I keep forgetting to move stuff around after. Our sideboard plan. I do have to point out before we start shuffling stuff around that this is one of those matchups I talk about where you're going to have a post-board plan that is never going to be ideal. I only have 15 cards in my sideboard, but here's 15 pieces of counter magic right here. So assuming I board out every single counter spell I've got into the Aether Vial Cavern of Souls deck and board in all 15 cards in my sideboard, which does still contain, in this case, 5 counter spells, I am never going to be able to cut all the counter spells. There is always, no matter what I do, going to be the chance that I've got a hand of just like 2 or 3 counter spells and my opponent goes turn 1 Cavern of Souls, Aether Vial, go. Can't do anything about it. So the best we can do is try to limit what all that does to us. So Toxic Deluge is the easiest auto include out of the sideboard. Consign to Memory has uses. It's better on the play than the draw because you can hit Aether Vial. I'm likely not bringing it in regardless, but you can hit like a Silvergill ETB or a Trickster ETB, something like that. So it's not abysmal, but cards like Mystical Dispute, Stern Scolding are kind of do the same job, but a little bit more efficiently. If they have a Cavern of Souls, again, sucks to suck, nothing you can do about it. Force Negation is completely coming out for me. Harbinger of the Seas. There are 4 Harbinger of the Seas deck. I'm not really expecting my own Harbinger to do anything impactful in the slightest. Spell Pierce, one of those things that like maybe you want to keep in Spell Pierce on the play and board them out on the draw. So some number of these 7 for at least these 6. If you want to board in, I don't know, just like a Nihil Spellbomb as a redraw, you could. If you want to keep in the Harbinger to just have another creature on board that you can play through their Harbingers, I can respect that. But any of like the non-creature counters are for sure coming out, and everything else is just, I'm going to hope you don't have Cavern of Souls. If you want to bring in Break the Ice for Cavern of Souls and Mutavault, you're more than welcome to. I really don't think I would suggest it. It's just so much more likely that they have a hand of like double island or something. Um, if we were still running spreading seas in the sideboard, that would change things up a little bit. I would bring in spreading seas in the matchup because not only does it hit Mutavault, Cavern of Souls, but it's not dead if they don't see those cards. I can just cast it on an island and redraw, and that counts for something. But without the spreading seas effect, I'm not really looking at going the land destruction route. Your entire game plan post board is first off, pray they don't have Cavern of Souls, pray they don't have second Cavern of Souls, pray they don't have Aether Vial. If you can stop an Aether Vial, really, really nice. We won a cool game the other day by Archmages charming our opponent's Aether Vial. A lot of your black cards, so your Fatal Pushes, Shoot the Sheriff, Psychic Frogs, Bowmasters, you run the risk of a Harbinger of the Seas just kind of locking you out. So do make sure that you can get basic swamp if necessary. It might feel bad to do so with cards like Archmage's Charm, but you'd rather be able to cast your spells than just be locked out of the game of all your removal. Because once Harbinger falls, it's pretty much Murktide Regent, sink into Stupor, Harbinger of your own, and that's like it. You can run into some instances where your opponent's Harbinger of the Seas shuts off their own Cavern of Souls or Mutavault or something. So just because your opponent drops a Harbinger doesn't always mean that it is optimal to counter the Harbinger. If you can get basic swamp and you've got a threat, it could very well be the case that you want to just let that Harbinger resolve to shut off a lot of their utility lands, and that will help you turn on like Mystical Dispute, Stern Scolding, Counterspell. So just pay attention to the board state and like where you're at in the game. If your opponent goes to slam like the Harbinger on turn 3 and you don't have basic swamp, you don't have access to it, and you're sitting there with like double Bowmaster Fatal Push in hand, just counter the Harbinger. But if you've already got, say, a frog down on 2 and your opponent slams a Harbinger on 3, and you've got like Counterspell Stern Scolding in hand or Counterspell Mystical Dispute, then you're probably just letting it go. Grinding Station, the Corey Baumeister special, because I'm pretty sure he's like the only person putting up any sort of consistent results with Grinding Station. I'm sure there's some people that like are 5-0ing occasionally, but as far as, oh, I did win a challenge. That's kind of cool. Good on them. Okay. Grinding Station. Really, really difficult deck to play with and against. Sideboard options for them: Veil of Summer, Soul Guide Lantern. About it. Negate's an interesting choice, but more likely just Veil of Summer, Soul Guide Lantern, and kind of hope on Emery value, Malevolent Rumble value. Things that they're sideboarding out of. Maybe a copy or two of Breach. Go a little less combo-y. Maybe a Rumble. Probably not. I don't know. I feel like everybody that plays Rumble is obsessed with Rumble. Haywire Might's a little weak, but you might just have to bring it in because of like Unlicensed Hearse, Nihil Spellbomb. I have seen some of these decks trimming on Urza's Saga, which is better for us. But if they are on the full 4 Urza's Saga, then that can be a little bit rougher. Thankfully, this deck doesn't pop out like nearly as much as it used to. So sideboarding for us, you know, the more important part of this conversation. Again, forgot to Forgot to de-sideboard from the last one. Sideboarding for us. Break the Ice only hits Saga, so not really much or enough of a reason there. Harbinger of the Seas can be okay. Takes out Saga. If they don't get their basic mountain early, can shut off like Shifting Woodlands. Can shut off Saga. They really don't have that many red removal spells. So it's another one of those, like, if you time it kind of correctly, it can be okay. It's not going to stop anything of the Tamiyo, Emery, Mox Amber, Grinding Station stuff. It does stop Underworld Breach from being cast. So remember what it can or can't counter, or what it can or can't stop your opponent from doing. You don't want to like go to force down a Harbinger when they've got, say, a blue creature, a Springleaf Drum, something like that you can't stop them from comboing after. Some amount of the Grave Hate. Mystical Dispute hits Emery, hits Tamiyo. Probably not boarding in Mystical Dispute. Probably just relying more on my removal spells. 6 is a 2/4, so Stern Scolding can hit 6, Emery, Tamiyo, and Thassa's Oracle. That's a little bit more enticing than Mystical Dispute. Toxic Deluge, I'm not particularly interested in. Consign, again, for like Urza's Saga trigger, hits 1 ring. Probably not countering a Mox Amber, but could. Can counter a Springleaf Drum, which is pretty nice. So some number of these things. Probably not Harbinger. Probably just like relying on my one Harbinger in the main. Alright. Bowmaster, a lot weaker because Bowmaster does not do anything into like Malevolent Rumble or Emery. Doesn't do anything on combo turn. You're just hoping to like get a little extra value off of Bobble or something, which isn't that reliable. So Bowmaster, Harbinger, I could see going either way. If you want to keep it in, keep it in. If you don't want to keep it in, then cut it. Archmage's Charm is a little slow. Spell Snare is a little slow. So, like, Spell Snare does counter Grinding Station and Underworld Breach. I guess Malevolent Rumble is actually a good reason to keep it in. But I usually avoid countering Grinding Station if you can. You don't really care about that one resolving. You more care about Underworld Breach. And if you spend your counters on Grinding Station, then you run the risk of them hitting an Underworld Breach late and being able to get back a Grinding Station anyway. So just save your Spell Snares for Breach and not for the Grinding Station. Yeah, I think out of the counter options, Archmage's Charm being 3 mana just makes it less efficient than some of the others. So probably something similar to this. I could very well see not bringing in Surgical Extraction if you just want to rely on Unlicensed Hearse and Spellbomb. I kind of like Surgical now that Shifting Woodlands is in the picture, because if they go to Woodlands copy like an Underworld Breach, you can Surgical the Underworld Breaches. Something like that, or like Surgical Urza's Saga, Surgical the One Ring. Like, they had enough targets that are high impact that I think you can find something to Surgical and be fairly happy. I just wouldn't rely on that being like your end-all be-all answer. I do think it's a matchup that Frog really, really shines in, because they've got like 4 copies of Unholy Heat, maybe a Pithing Needle, maybe a Bolt, and that's like their only real answers to it. So jamming a Frog on turn 2, outgrowing an Unholy Heat, and then having having a piece of like Grave Hate can kind of seal the deal for you. If you see them going more blue, maybe Teferi Time Reveler or Ledger Shredder, something like that. The more blue you see, the more likely Mystical Dispute is to be a pretty good live card for you. So I could see Mystical Dispute over the Consign, over like Stern Scolding, something like that. But the more they go away from blue towards like all the green stuff, Malevolent Rumble, Veil of Summer, 6 in this case, the less interested I am in having Mystical Dispute in the deck. Like you can see some of these lists that are heavy blue with Preordained, Consider, Emery, Tameo, boarding in some Mystical Disputes and Metallic Rebukes of their own. This is the kind of list that I would want to bring in Mystical Dispute against. So keep that in mind. I couldn't really decide what I wanted my last sideboard option to be, and I was kind of looking around. Finally decided mono black. I do think the deck has been hit pretty hard since the grief ban, so I'm not really expecting to see a lot of it, but that doesn't mean it's not still out there. I know somebody was playing it in the feature match of the Apex Gaming event that was going on like this past weekend. So Mono Black still exists. You can keep an eye on it. I think the biggest selling point of Mono Black is the fact that they run 4 copies of Dalthy Voidwalker in the sideboard, which dodges our Shoot the Sheriff. So if you're looking for a reason for Mono Black, that's about all I got. But nah, the deck's fine. You just need to accept that it's Ring, Necro, or Bust. And you can't really double up spells the way you could before with Grief plus your big payoff. So sideboarding for them against us, Dalthy, Graveyard Trespasser. Those are about it. Boarding out some stuff like Inquisition is a little meh. Meat Hook Massacre is pretty bad. March is okay. So yeah, I'd say like Inquisition or Meat Hook Massacre for sure. Inquisition, some number. March, some number. I'd call it a day. So we'll go back to our side. 0 for 12 on sideboarding or de-sideboarding from the last one. You can tell we're recording these all back to back to back to back to back by the fact that nothing is updated. Sideboarding for us. Stern Scolding is okay. It's probably better than okay because it does hit Orcish Bowmaster, hits Boggart Trawler, hits Dalthy out of the sideboard, does not hit Shieldred, and does not hit Graveyard Trespasser. Would hit Grief if they still had it, but probably still fine to bring in. Consigned to Memory seems very underwhelming, but it does hit the 1 ring. It does hit the draw trigger into turn with Necro Dominance, which I've had games where my opponents had like a Shieldred. I didn't have an answer to it. The next turn they played out a Necro, went to their end of turn. I consigned the Necro trigger, untapped, and like found an answer to Shieldred. Or found like a Sink into Stupor for Necro or something. So you can buy yourself a little bit of time with Consign. It's not the greatest board in, but a lot of times you're not looking for great. You're looking for passable. Spell Snare completely depends on if they're bringing in Dalthy. If they're not bringing in Dalthy, then I don't think Spell Snare just for Bowmasters is enough of a reason. If they are bringing in Dalthy, then I can see leaving the Spell Snares in. Harbinger's pretty bad. They've just got too many basic swamps, too many ways to play around it. Everything else is kind of reasonable if you think you've got enough counters beyond Consign. So like if you don't want to bring in Consign for the 1 ring, then I would say just like board in the 2 Stern Scoldings, board out a Spell Snare and a Harbinger, and just stick with something like that. Keep it pretty minimal. As far as Murktide itself goes, they've got Troller to try to keep you off of it, Thoughtseize to try to take it, Fell the Profane to try to kill it. And those are kind of the only options they have as far as removing it. Fell the Profane being a 4-mana instant is a very costly way of doing so. So if you're able to find like Murktide plus Force Negation, then you usually don't have that many things to worry about forcing. Your entire game plan, though, should be keep the One Ring, keep Necro off the board. If you can do those two things, you're probably going to be okay. Bowmaster. I've kind of said it about the other One Ring matchups. Most of the decks that are playing the One Ring have started finding a lot of ways to make Bowmaster less effective, whether that's playing less X1s or playing more like free ways of interacting with Bowmaster, subtlety, whatnot. Mono Black doesn't really have that luxury. With Necro and One Ring both being kind of tap out plays, you usually don't have to worry about your Bowmaster dying. So if you think your opponent has a Necro or a One Ring, maybe you want to just play out the Bowmaster proactively to get them to not play into it for a turn. For example, if it's my opponent's turn 2 and they've got 2 lands down, one of which is tapped. So maybe they've got a basic Swamp up and a Boggart Trawler that they didn't pay life for. Then maybe I consider just flashing in the Bowmaster proactively, because if my opponent doesn't have a Fatal Push right there, they might not play out their Necro Dominance into my Bowmaster on turn 3 and risk me just making a really big army token and shooting them in the face a lot. So keep those things in mind. Just try to leverage what you can do beyond just the Necro turns. But Force Negation is going to be like one of your best friends, because being able to tap out for a Frog or tap out for a Murktide and force a One Ring or a Necro on their turn can be back-breaking. So yeah, that's all I got for this little sideboard guide for Dimir FrogTide. Hopefully it helps you put a little thought into what you got going on, what matchups you're having trouble with, what kind of avenues you haven't tried yet but maybe want to. And you can find some success in some of these popular matchups across your RCQ season or modern leagues, modern challenges, any of the above. Again, I really just want to reiterate, because I feel like it's the kind of content like this is very subjective. It's my thoughts and opinions, what has or hasn't worked for me based on my play style and the decisions that I make that influence the direction the game is going. So again, don't take anything I say as being like this, oh, this is right statement. I never like making this is right statements. I like making, based on my experience, this is how things have played out for me. This is what has worked for me. So that's what I'm going to pass along. So if anything doesn't work for you, if you disagree with anything, then always follow your own gut. That's the best way, I think, to play Magic, because at the end of the day, like, if you're confident in your decision making and you're confident in your choices, then everybody else's choices can go kick rocks. But yeah, other than that, thanks so much for tuning into the video. Hope you all have a fantastic rest of your day. Stay safe. Enjoy some good food and company. I will catch y'all back live later. Adios for now.